Fresh off a grueling 6-month medical mission overseas, Dr. Naomi Reed stepped into the bustling airport, ready to finally return home. Exhausted but proud, she carried nothing but her luggage and the quiet satisfaction of saving lives. But as she made her way through security, everything took a turn. A TSA officer, stern-faced and suspicious, pulled her aside without explanation. Naomi was questioned aggressively, her credentials ignored, and she was made to feel like a criminal in front of dozens of onlookers. But just 7 minutes later, the situation flipped in a way no one expected, and that officer found himself walking out of the terminal without his badge. What happened next didn't just clear Naomi's name, it ignited a conversation that rippled far beyond the airport walls. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if stories of justice and resilience inspire you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss out. The airport was alive with the ceaseless hum of movement, bodies passing one another, each caught in the private whirlwind of their own journey. The polished floors reflected the sharp, sterile lights overhead, and the air was thick with the scent of perfumes mingling with jet fuel. At first glance, it was a place of order. But beneath that surface, if you listened closely, there were tremors, subtle but steady, the kind of dissonance that comes from knowing not everyone walks through these spaces the same way. Alexia Hayes entered with the quiet poise of someone who had spent years learning to carry the weight of expectation on her back. Her stride was deliberate, her gaze sharp but unthreatening. The world often mistook grace for submission, and she had long learned how to let that misunderstanding serve her. She wore a tailored navy blazer that hugged her frame, and her heels clicked softly against the floor, each step like punctuation to a story only she could read. The first sign was small, hardly worth noting, if not for what followed. A young sales associate in the duty-free shop, blonde and bright-eyed, stiffened slightly as Alexia approached the display of watches. There was no hostility in her expression, just the cautious neutrality of someone taught to monitor the margins. A glance too long, a shift in posture too subtle to confront, but unmistakable all the same. Alexia smiled politely, reaching for a sleek gold watch under the glass. It was a reflex, a gesture honed over decades, the kind of smile that said, "I belong here." "Excuse me, ma'am," the sales associate's voice cut through the air, crisp and rehearsed. "Can I help you find something?" It was the question behind the question that caught Alexia's ear, the small hook buried beneath the pleasantries. "Can I help you, or should I stop you?" "No, thank you," Alexia replied, setting the watch back down with care. Her tone, polite but firm, left no room for lingering conversation. The associate nodded, but her eyes didn't follow the next customer. Instead, she exchanged a glance with a man near the register, an older employee with tired eyes and a too-tight tie. There it was again, the small shift. Alexia continued down the aisle, aware now of the way the gaze followed her. Like a shadow she could never quite shake. It would have been easy to leave, easy to let it roll off her shoulders, like the dozens of times before. But she lingered, not out of pride, but out of something quieter, an unwillingness to let the story unfold the way it always did. Injustice, Alexia knew, was rarely loud. It didn't come in grand declarations or public battles. More often, it was a series of small, unremarkable choices: a turned head, a second glance, the tightening of a hand around a purse strap. She could feel it happening now. In real time, another associate appeared, his tie matching the first man's. He hovered at the corner of her vision, rearranging items that needed no rearranging. Alexia sighed, pretending to examine a bottle of perfume. "Routine checks," he mumbled, loud enough for her to hear. Routine. That was the word that stayed with her. The simplicity of it, the way it allowed men like him to step back into the shadows of their own intent. No accusation, no confrontation, just routine. But even as the word echoed in her mind, Alexia knew better. Nothing about this was routine. Alexia's hands hovered over the perfume bottle, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. For a moment, she considered how easy it would be to put it down and leave. Walk away clean, avoid the weight of whatever storm was building behind her. But the thing about storms is, they know how to follow. She placed the bottle back with a gentle precision, her fingers lingering just long enough to show she wasn't in a rush. She had learned that the fastest way to become guilty in places like this was to act like you were in a hurry. The world watched people like her differently, scrutinized the rhythm of their movements. Waiting for the wrong note. A clock ticked somewhere behind the counter. Too faint to be real but loud enough to feel imagined. From the corner of her eye, she caught the second associate now speaking with the first, a quick exchange of whispers that danced just beneath the threshold of hearing. Alexia straightened her back, shifting the weight of her bag over her shoulder. A few steps forward. Another aisle. But even here, in this small temple to commerce, she could feel the slow unraveling. A man browsing nearby, middle-aged and sunburned from whatever tropical vacation he was returning from, suddenly found himself interested in the very shelf she was passing. He didn't look directly at her, men like him rarely did, but his eyes darted just enough to betray him. It was subtle, the choreography of suspicion. Another step. The saleswoman drifted out from behind the counter, her gaze sweeping the floor like she was searching for something she'd lost. Alexia glanced up just in time to meet her eyes. That was the first real misstep. Because if you let them know you see it, the game shifts. Ma'am, the voice was low and practiced, as if she had been waiting for this moment. I'm going to have to ask you to stay right where you are. Alexia paused, letting the words settle between them. And why is that? She asked, her voice as steady as the marble beneath her feet. There's been some confusion. The woman's hands clasped in front of her like a prayer she didn't believe in. Alexia let the silence stretch, holding the gaze just long enough for the woman to start shifting from foot to foot. She knew this part well. This was where the cracks began to show, where uncertainty made the ground uneven. Confusion, Alexia repeated. That's an interesting word. What exactly seems to be confusing you? The woman opened her mouth, but the second associate cut in. He had been inching closer, waiting for his chance. We've had issues, he said plainly, with theft. It's standard procedure to check when something feels off. That was the word, feels. Alexia's breath slowed, though she kept her face smooth. Feels had been chasing her for as long as she could remember. It followed her into department stores, shadowed her in parking lots. It waited for her in elevators when she was the first to step inside. What exactly felt off? Alexia asked. The man blinked, his confidence dimming just a shade. Look, he said, voice tightening. We don't want trouble. If you could just show us your bag, we can clear this up and… No. The word came sharper than she intended, cutting the space between them like glass. Behind her, the sunburned man had stopped pretending to browse. Now he was just watching. They always watched. I won't be showing you my bag, Alexia said calmly, but you can call security if you'd like. I'm sure they'll be thrilled to explain what exactly I've done wrong. The man hesitated. This was the second misstep. Because power, once questioned, often stumbles. I'm not sure that's necessary. The woman chimed in, her voice too light, too quick. She was trying to pull the reins back, but the horses were already loose. Alexia smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. Then I'll continue browsing. And just like that, she turned, walking slowly down the aisle, letting the silence in her wake speak louder than she ever could. But as she moved, she knew this wasn't over. The perfume aisle stretched on longer than it should have. Each step Alexia took felt heavier, though her heels barely whispered against the polished floor. She passed rows of neatly arranged bottles, their glass faces catching the overhead lights, shimmering like trophies she hadn't earned the right to hold. Behind her, the quiet wasn't as empty as it pretended to be. The saleswoman lingered by the counter, fiddling with a register that needed no attention. The man, the second one, the one who couldn't quite hide the suspicion beneath his professionalism, pretended to stock cologne. His hands moving slower now. Deliberate, watching without watching. This wasn't new, but that didn't make it lighter to carry. Alexia had spent her life in spaces like this, places built to appear open, inviting, but lined with invisible walls. Walls that only people like her ever seemed to bump into. And every time it happened, she had to make a choice, to stop and explain the bruise or pretend she'd walked into nothing at all. Today, though, she could feel it pressing in closer, sharper. As she neared the end of the aisle, Alexia caught sight of a display case lined with sleek, dark watches. She paused. It wasn't the watches she cared about, but the way the glass reflected the space behind her. From the corner of the case, she watched as the man took a slow step forward. A hand hovered near his waist, not resting, but ready. He wouldn't stop her here. No, that wasn't how this worked. There was a rhythm to these encounters. And Alexia knew the next step. She would reach the exit. Just close enough for the door to tease the possibility of freedom. That's when they'd move, when they could frame it as prevention, as caution, as anything but what it really was. She let out a slow breath. The glass case showed more than the man's approach. A few feet away, an older couple browsed nearby, their backs hunched in the particular way people get when they've lived long enough to stop hurrying. They were close enough to see, close enough to hear, but their eyes never lifted from the shelves. That was how these things always unfolded. There was never a scene, only a series of quiet betrayals. Alexia straightened, brushing invisible dust from her sleeve. The reflection of the man behind her shifted, leaning slightly toward his coworker. A brief exchange. Here it comes. She took one more step toward the exit, toward whatever was waiting for her on the other side of this glass facade of civility. "Ma'am." The word struck like a match. Small but bright enough to pull every eye in the vicinity. Alexia turned slowly. The man stood just a few feet away now, closer than he had any right to be. His smile was there, but it hung loose on his face, as though it might slip off if he spoke too plainly. "May I see your bag, please?" he asked. Not requested, asked, as though he was offering her a choice he knew she wouldn't take. Alexia met his eyes and held them, long enough for him to realize she wasn't afraid. "Why?" she said simply. His smile tightened. "It's just policy," he replied. "Nothing personal." Ah, there it was, the universal bomb. The phrase wrapped in silk that they believed could undo the sting. Nothing personal. But Alexia had learned long ago that nothing was more personal than the way people chose to enforce their rules. "I'd like to know which policy," she said, her voice calm but cool enough to draw the air in tighter around them. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. "I don't make the rules," he answered, shifting slightly. "No," Alexia said, "you just choose when to apply them." The couple nearby had stopped pretending. The older man shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his wife's arm as if to usher her down another aisle. But she lingered, her eyes flicking between Alexia and the associate as though she recognized the shape of this moment like she'd seen it before but had forgotten the ending. Alexia could feel the weight of their watching. But she didn't flinch. "If you'd prefer," the man said, his voice softening into something that tried to sound reasonable, "we can wait for the manager." Alexia smiled then, though there was no warmth in it. "I think that's a good idea," she replied, folding her arms. "Let's wait." She wasn't in a hurry. And now, neither was he. Time slowed the way it always did when dignity was on trial. Alexia stood near the exit, her arms folded across her chest, as the seconds stretched into something heavier than they should have been. The sales associate had retreated slightly, keeping just enough distance to preserve the illusion of professionalism, but not far enough to let the moment dissolve. A crowd was beginning to form, not an obvious one, but the kind that pretended to browse while their ears leaned in. An older man rubbed his thumb across the rim of a whiskey bottle he had no intention of buying. A woman in a silk scarf rearranged perfume samples that were already neatly aligned. They wouldn't speak. They rarely did. Alexia had seen it before, the quiet complicity of people who believed silence absolved them of participation. The manager arrived as expected, tall, white, and wrapped in the sort of polite confidence that came from knowing the world made space for him wherever he went. His name tag read Gregory Lewis. He wasn't much older than Alexia, but he carried himself like a man who had never had to second-guess his own authority. "Is there a problem here?" Gregory asked, his tone rehearsed and dry. The associate stepped forward quickly, eager to explain before Alexia had the chance. There was some confusion, he began, choosing his words carefully. "We've had a few incidents lately, and I thought it best to check." Gregory's eyes flicked to Alexia, scanning her like an unread document. "Incidents," Alexia repeated, her voice cutting through the stale air like the edge of a blade. "What kind of incidents?" Gregory's smile came fast, too fast. "Nothing serious, of course," he replied. "We just try to stay vigilant. I'm sure you understand." Alexia did understand. She understood all too well. She could have left it there, paid for her perfume, walked out with her head high, and let them pat themselves on the back for how gracious they had been. But she stayed, not out of pride. Pride was the luxury of those who weren't required to defend their existence. She stayed because leaving meant accepting the terms they had set for her. You thought I was stealing, Alexia said plainly. Gregory's smile wavered. No one said that. But that's what you meant. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. He shifted, glancing at the onlookers who now made no effort to hide their curiosity. Ma'am, if we could just… No, Alexia interrupted, her voice low but unmistakable. You stopped me. You questioned me. Now explain why. Gregory exhaled slowly, measuring his next words. It's just protocol, he said, a thin layer of apology softening the edge of his tone. If you haven't done anything, this will all be over in a minute. There it was. If. A small word, but heavy enough to tilt the balance of the room. Alexia stepped closer, until the space between them evaporated. And if I have done something? She asked. What then? Gregory opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked to the associate for help. But the man now stood frozen, unwilling to share the weight of this moment. The silence grew teeth. You stopped me because I don't look like the kind of woman who belongs here, Alexia said, the calm in her voice sharper than any accusation. You don't have to say it. I've been hearing it my whole life. The older man with the whiskey bottle set it down quietly and slipped away. The woman in the silk scarf lowered her eyes. Gregory's smile was gone now, replaced by something harder to disguise, the quiet embarrassment of a man caught mid-act, unsure whether to defend himself or apologize. I'm sorry if you felt uncomfortable, he offered. Alexia tilted her head slightly. If. Gregory swallowed. She let the word linger, hanging between them like a question he couldn't answer. And then, just as calmly as she had spoken, Alexia lifted the perfume bottle from the counter, walked to the register, and placed it down. I'll pay for this now, she said, her eyes never leaving Gregory's. He nodded stiffly, signaling to the cashier, who fumbled with the keys as though the weight of the room had shifted to her. As the receipt printed, Gregory took a step back, folding his hands behind him. I hope this won't prevent you from shopping with us again, he said, trying to reclaim whatever authority remained. Alexia smiled, the kind of smile that didn't ask for forgiveness. Oh, I'll be back, she replied, but I'm not the one who should be worried about returning. And with that, she collected her things, stepped through the automatic doors, and left the weight of Gregory's discomfort behind her. But even as she walked away, Alexia knew men like him never carried that weight for long. Alexia left the store, but the air around her still felt heavy, as if she carried some of it out with her, tucked beneath her blazer where no one could see. The terminal stretched wide ahead of her, bright and busy, but the sounds faded into the distance. She kept walking, not because she was late, but because to stop would mean giving the moment permission to catch up with her. She passed a family huddled near a bench, the father thumbing through his phone while his daughter slept against her mother's shoulder. A group of flight attendants in crisp uniforms glided past, speaking in hushed tones, heads tilted toward each other. None of them looked at her, but she could still feel the weight of Gregory's gaze, as if he were watching from the store, his eyes pressing against her back like fingerprints left on glass. It wasn't the confrontation itself that unsettled her. She had lived long enough to know that battles like these were rarely loud. More often, they lingered after the words had been spoken, after the apologies had been issued. Racism did not always announce itself with slurs and violence. Sometimes, it slipped into the room dressed in protocol and policies, nodding politely from behind a counter. She was used to that part. What haunted her now was the way Gregory would remember the encounter if he remembered it at all. To him, it was a misunderstanding, an unfortunate mix-up that would dissolve with time, tucked neatly between his morning coffee and next week's staff meeting. A blip, a minor incident. But to Alexia, it was not a blip. It was a brick, one more added to the wall she carried with her. The one she had been building since she was old enough to recognize why sales clerks followed her through department stores while letting others walk free. The trouble with moments like this wasn't that they ended, it was that they never fully did. The voices of the crowd swelled as she approached the gate, blending into the soft hum of announcements overhead. Alexia found a seat near the window, far enough from the others to feel the distance but close enough to watch the planes rise and disappear into the clouds. She pulled out her phone, flicking through emails she had no intention of answering. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted softly. Alexia looked up. A woman stood before her. Younger, maybe mid-20s. Her hair was tied back into a neat bun, and the badge clipped to her blouse suggested she worked somewhere in the airport. I'm sorry to bother you, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I just wanted to say, I saw what happened back there. Alexia's expression didn't change, but she could feel the muscles in her shoulders tighten. And? Alexia asked, not unkindly. The woman glanced around, as if afraid someone might overhear. I work in retail too. I know how they are. I've seen it before. Alexia waited. I guess I just wanted to say thank you, the woman added quickly, for not letting it slide. Alexia's gaze softened, though she said nothing for a long moment. You shouldn't have to thank me for that, she replied finally, her voice low but steady. The woman nodded. I know, but still, it meant something. Alexia offered the faintest smile, one she wasn't sure felt sincere but hoped would be enough. As the woman turned to leave, Alexia watched her disappear into the crowd. She wondered how many others had watched from behind perfume displays and glass counters, holding their breath but saying nothing. That was the quiet tragedy of it all. For every confrontation, there were a dozen unspoken echoes. And no matter how far Alexia walked, she could still hear them following her. The gate area was crowded now. People gathered in clusters, balancing paper coffee cups and suitcases, their conversations rising and falling like distant waves. The speakers overhead hummed with announcements that blurred into white noise. Alexia sat by the window, eyes fixed on the runway. But her mind lingered somewhere else, somewhere behind her. Back in the duty-free shop, where Gregory Lewis was likely smoothing out the wrinkles of the morning. Ready to forget. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. Anger, Alexia had learned, was like fire in a cold room. It warmed you, but left everything else untouched. What unsettled her wasn't the flames, but the ash, the quiet remains that settled in places no one thought to clean. Her phone vibrated. A message from David, her assistant. Flight delay. Looks like another hour. Let me know if you need anything. Alexia exhaled slowly and set the phone down. Airports had a way of forcing stillness. The waiting, the lines, the wait times stretched and thinned. And in that stillness, the echoes grew louder. A seat opened next to her. And a man older, black, with silver threading through his beard, lowered himself into it. He wore a wool overcoat despite the warm airport air. Alexia caught his reflection in the window before glancing his way. Afternoon, he said, tipping his head slightly. She returned the nod. The two sat in silence for a while, watching the planes drift in and out of the horizon. Finally, he spoke again. You from around here? No, Alexia replied, just passing through. The man smiled faintly. Aren't we all? Something about his tone made Alexia look at him more closely. There was a weight to his voice, the kind that only comes with time. Or with living through enough years to know that time and survival aren't always the same thing. I saw what happened earlier, he added, his eyes never leaving the window. In the shop, Alexia's body tensed, though she kept her face still. Did you? He nodded. Watched the whole thing. Reminded me of some things I'd nearly forgotten. Or tried to. There it was. The thing no one liked to say aloud, that memory. For people like them, was not something to hold. It was something to survive. I thought about stepping in. The man continued, his voice quiet, but I didn't, and that's been sitting with me since. Alexia turned toward him. You shouldn't feel bad about that, she said, though the words felt empty the moment they left her mouth. The man chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Shouldn't, maybe, but I do. You see, I've been around long enough to know better. And there was a time when I wouldn't have let something like that slide. He paused, as if pulling the words carefully from someplace deep. But these days, I don't know. The fight feels heavier now. Alexia studied him, sensing the weariness in his shoulders, the same weariness she felt in her own. It shouldn't have to be a fight, she replied softly. But it always is, he said, finally meeting her gaze, even when no one calls it that. Alexia nodded, because there was nothing else to say. The truth of it hung between them, too familiar to be denied. The speaker overhead crackled to life, announcing boarding for a flight to Atlanta. The man shifted in his seat, adjusting his coat. That's me, he said, rising slowly. I guess I just wanted to say, you handled it well. Better than I might have. Alexia smiled faintly. I've had practice. He nodded. We all have. As he walked away, Alexia watched him until he disappeared into the line at the gate. In the reflection of the window, she could still see herself sitting alone now, but carrying the weight of that conversation. as if the man had handed her something fragile before leaving. And she knew that weight wouldn't be going anywhere soon. The boarding gate filled and emptied again. But Alexia remained seated, her eyes distant as if watching a movie only she could see. The echoes of that conversation, of Gregory's thinly veiled condescension, and the silent stares of the onlookers circled her like shadows stretching with the setting sun. She should have let it go. That was what the world wanted, what it had always wanted. To be forgiven without asking. To be absolved without apology. But Alexia had grown tired of letting things slip quietly into the past. Only to meet them again further down the road, wearing different names and faces. Her phone buzzed, snapping her back to the present. It was David again. The head of retail operations for the airport chain just called. They're requesting a meeting with you tomorrow. Something about a misunderstanding in one of their stores. Alexia's lips curled into a dry smile. Misunderstanding. The word was beginning to wear thin. She typed back, "Schedule it. I'll be there." Her thumb hovered over the screen. But she didn't hit send right away. She thought of Gregory, his tightly wound authority unraveling under the weight of her silence. And she thought of the man by the window, his tired voice echoing the things she knew but rarely spoke aloud. The fight does feel heavier now. Alexia exhaled and pressed send. Blank. Blank. By the time the meeting room door clicked shut behind her the next morning, Alexia could already read the atmosphere like a well-worn book. The room was expensive but sterile gray walls, a glass table stretching the length of it, and leather chairs that were too stiff to suggest comfort. 3 men in suits sat at one end, their faces drawn in tight, polite expressions. Gregory was not among them, but his absence spoke louder than his presence ever could. "Ms. Hayes," one of the men began, offering a hand. "I'm Evan Parker, head of retail operations. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us on such short notice." Alexia shook his hand briefly, but her eyes remained cold. "I understand this is about an incident yesterday," she replied, taking a seat without invitation. Evan shifted slightly, exchanging a glance with the man to his left. "Yes, well, there seems to have been some confusion regarding protocol." That word again, confusion. Alexia crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap, settling in like someone preparing to stay longer than anyone wanted her to. "Tell me, Mr. Parker," she said smoothly, "is it protocol to stop paying customers under the assumption that they're thieves? Or does that policy only apply to people who look like me?" Evan's posture stiffened. The man beside him cleared his throat. "Of course not, Ms. Hayes," Evan said quickly. "We deeply regret the situation and want to assure you that—" "I don't need assurances," Alexia cut in, her voice soft but sharp enough to make the room colder. "I need accountability." The third man, younger than the others, finally spoke up. His voice was careful, measured, the way people speak when they're not used to being challenged. "What happened was unacceptable," he said, leaning forward, "and we intend to address it directly with the staff involved." Alexia tilted her head slightly. "Is Gregory Lewis still employed here?" Evan hesitated for a fraction too long. "He's been placed on leave," he answered, but his tone betrayed the reluctance behind those words. Alexia's gaze didn't waver. "Leave is temporary," she said. "Racism isn't." The silence that followed was the kind that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Evan leaned forward, as if proximity might soften the edges of the conversation. "Ms. Hayes," he began carefully, "we appreciate your perspective, but—" "There's no but, Mr. Parker," Alexia interrupted. "I'm not here to negotiate the terms of my dignity. I want a public acknowledgement of what happened. I want a full review of your staff training programs. And I want Gregory Lewis removed, not suspended. Not quietly reassigned. Gone." Evan's polite smile faded. "That's a lot to ask," the younger man murmured. Alexia leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of the room settle. "I imagine being black in America feels like a lot to you, too," she replied calmly. "But we do it anyway." No one spoke for a long moment. Finally, Evan exhaled and gave a slow nod. "I'll bring your requests to the board," he said. Alexia's eyes narrowed slightly, her gaze holding his until he shifted again under its weight. "No," she said quietly. "You won't bring them to the board. You'll make sure they're approved." Evan's jaw tightened, but he nodded. The meeting ended without ceremony. But Alexia didn't leave right away. She lingered just long enough to let the silence in the room breathe, let it stretch until the weight of her absence became the only thing left to hold onto. As she stepped into the hallway, the younger man followed her out, his footsteps quick to match her pace. "Ms. Hayes," he called softly. Alexia paused, glancing over her shoulder. "I just wanted to say." He hesitated. "I think what you're doing, it matters. Even if they don't show it." Alexia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "They don't have to show it," she replied. "They'll feel it eventually." And with that, she walked away, the sound of her heels echoing like footsteps in an empty room. The city lay quiet beneath the soft hum of dusk. From the window of her apartment, Alexia watched as the lights flickered to life in the buildings across the skyline. Tiny bursts of electricity warding off the night. It was the kind of view that should have brought peace. But tonight, the calmness felt like something fragile, something waiting to be broken. Her phone sat on the table, face down, but she knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. There was always another call, another meeting, another apology shaped like a favor. The aftermath of confrontation never ended neatly. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread. The email from Evan Parker had arrived an hour ago. "Gregory Lewis is no longer employed with us. We'll issue a public statement this week. I hope this resolves matters." But Alexia knew better. Resolves. That was a word they loved to use, as if dignity could be packaged and delivered with a receipt. As if the dismissal of one man could erase the quiet, persistent architecture of suspicion built into every corner of this country. Gregory's absence wouldn't dismantle the system that created him. Alexia could still see the way he looked at her that day. Could still hear the apology he never quite gave. And if she closed her eyes long enough, she could recall the first time she felt that gaze, not in an airport store, but in a classroom at 9 years old, when a teacher's hand lingered too long over her test paper, searching for the mistake she must have made. Racism had a way of staying with you. It grew roots in your memory, sprouting in places you thought had been left untouched. She turned away from the window, walking slowly toward the kitchen, letting the floor creak beneath her steps. Alexia poured a glass of water and stood at the counter, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. She thought of the older man at the airport gate, the woman who whispered thank you in passing, and Maya, the quiet employee who had witnessed it all but said nothing until the storm had passed. Their faces lingered like ghosts in the room. The truth was, this fight wasn't just about Gregory or Evan or any of the polished men who filled those boardrooms. It was about the Mayas of the world, the ones who watched from the edges, wondering if silence was safer than speaking. Alexia knew that feeling too well. And she knew that every battle she fought in the open was for the ones who hadn't yet found their voice. Her phone buzzed. Maya's name flashed across the screen. Alexia answered, her voice steady. "Ms. Hayes, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Maya said softly. "Not at all," Alexia replied. "What's on your mind?" There was a pause, the kind that felt like someone choosing their words carefully. "I just wanted you to know, after you left, some of the staff started talking about Gregory, about the way things have been for a while now. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you weren't the only one." Alexia closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the weight of those words settle. "You never are," she said quietly. "Not really." Maya hesitated, then asked, Do you think it'll get better?" Alexia thought about that for a long time. "I think it can," she answered finally. "But not because they decide to change. It'll get better because we decide not to let them forget." The line held steady for a moment longer before Maya exhaled, the soft sound of relief slipping through the speaker. "Thank you," Maya whispered. Alexia smiled faintly. "Get some rest, Maya. I'll see you soon." As the call ended, Alexia set the phone down and leaned against the counter, the city lights stretching long shadows across the walls. She knew this wasn't the end. There would always be another Gregory, another gate, another room filled with polite men offering empty resolutions. But there would also be another Maya. And as long as that was true, Alexia knew she could keep going. She returned to the window, watching the city pulse beneath her, a reminder that even in darkness, there was always light trying to break through.